right now with Jason. We are going to discuss how the sausage actually gets made. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Jason Cutter. Thanks for joining me on the program.
Thanks for having me. I am excited for wherever this goes and whatever we chat about. How I can help the audience out there.
Well, and what I love about the opportunity to bring guys like you onto the program has much to do with just the sheer amount of effort you put into creating, distributing, and offering up for consumption really high value content for the universe when it comes to the discipline of selling, which hence your presence here on the So You're in Sales podcast. We are birds of a feather. While we may not agree on all of the nomenclature that we use, right? Do you remember? Do you remember
Yep.
what I said to you the first time?
I do. I very vividly. It burns in my head. I'm like, wait, do I like this guy? Oh yeah, that's right. I do like him.
I said, I have feelings about this topic.
Feelings in quotes, which is very PC. I'm like, okay, all right.
But what we really arrived at was, words aside, it was the idea of being a professional in your craft and studying the discipline of what it means to be really good at being in sales, which Jason and I both recognize and appreciate that even when you're really good, you suck 7 out of 10 times. So, trying to make the best of what those 3 look like is really where I think Jason and I share an opinion about studying the ways to try to do that. And then, dude, here's the thing. I mean, from a content creator to another content creator, bravo. Like you are, almost no one I know is as prolific a content creator as you are. We have a couple in our industry, Kirby Hasseman, shout out. Guy, it's unbelievable. He's got at least something every day, oftentimes multiple things in a day, which is crazy. But I understand, just by the nature of me producing this content amongst some other things that I do, I recognize and appreciate the quantity of effort and time that's necessary in order to be able to be that prolific in content creation and distribution. So I wanted to unpack that a little bit. If you would be cool with letting us look behind the kimono here a little bit when it comes to what it means to do what it is that you do. Is that cool?
Yeah, let's do it. Instead of the feelings about authenticity, let's go with the content route. That should be fun.
I think the people will care more about this part than what
sure.
words get used, right? So,
yep.
From a purely the way you arrange how you create your programs, are you trying to? And what is really the other piece of this is just astonishing to me is that how much of this what you do is guest driven. Like, as someone who brings guests onto his program, I know it's 3 times the work of just putting out a piece of content on your own, because you have to source the guests, you have to think about the topic, you have to come up with the things you want to talk about. You want to make sure you've done some research on the person that you've brought onto the program to make it feel like this is something we really want to talk about. That all takes a tremendous amount of time. So, do you organize your guests around topic threads? Do you try to find people that match ongoing threads within your content, or do you try to let the guest take you where their story goes? Like, how do you approach that piece of it?
Yeah, so if we're talking about my podcasts, plural, just so people know, so I have technically 3 podcasts right now. One I won't categorize in relative to what you're asking about. I'll explain why in a minute. So I have 2. One is the Authentic Persuasion show, which started life as the Sales Experience podcast, which started life in April of 2019. So new to consulting, started my business. At that point, technically no clients. And I'm like, hey, I was in the process of writing my book. It was in the editing phase. And I'm like, I just need to start a podcast. And when I did, it was, and for as long as I had that show, it's kind of on hold right now, 5 days a week, sub 15 minutes episode. The first 100 episodes were me on a solo, just talking about sales, mostly topics from my books, from my book. And then I got into guests, and then I found that I really enjoyed guests, and a balance between guests and then my own, because sometimes there's things I just want to talk about. I don't want to monopolize the guest conversations. So for me, what it was really about my network, and it was two main strategies. One was looking for guests in my network, people I knew that I just wanted to have cool conversations with. And for that podcast, it was about sales. So who could be valuable to an audience listening to a sales podcast that most likely was also not a fellow sales coach and consultant. I did have some people like that early on. And then I realized I want to bring more than just talking to somebody about the stuff that I enjoy, something different, kind of like this, right? Instead of us talking about sales stuff, let's talk about something different that would help the audience. And so marketing people, technology, voice coach, different things like that. It was really about what could be valuable and what would be fun and what was I curious about, because I always think that makes a really good show. And then the other part was relationship building. Who do I want to have relationships with that could be, in my world, really good partners? So as a consultant, one of the things is I work with companies, but getting access to the decision maker at that company who says, yes, I would like some help, is challenging because A, most people don't want to admit they have a problem, and B, who are they going to tell that to or share? And then how often does that come up? So what I found is partnerships are much more valuable to me, which is somebody who's selling a CRM system into a call center. They know the people there. That company could say, we're having challenges. We wish our reps could close more deals. Enter me. And that's good. So having guests on the podcast for me was partnership related. Like, who do I want more relationship with without feeling gross and pushing it, right? Just let it naturally happen. And then also, what content can I create that's good for them, good for me, good for the audience, highlights them. Keeping in mind, most people aren't on podcasts as much as professional guests, let's say, like myself, where it's really exciting to be on a podcast. I mean, I remember the first some that I was on, and it was like, this is amazing. And so I love doing that with people who have never been on a podcast because it's super fun. And then they're excited to share it, and it's great. So that's really like my guest kind of focused and strategy. And then a lot of it is just constantly having conversations or looking at other podcasts in the similar space and what kind of guests they have on there, and then farming those lists and being like, okay, if you liked being on that podcast, you'll like being on my podcast. And then, starting conversations with them.
Yeah. And there's layers of solution to what I love about what I witness in other prolific content creators. I'm nowhere near your scale, but I'm dedicated to the craft of putting out things that I think, when found, would raise the level of credibility for me in that person's mind. So that by the time they arrive at a moment when they're like, oh shit, I have that problem. Let me give Roger a call, because clearly he's shown to me, by virtue of this incredibly long tail of content that we've created around the discipline of selling, that we are curious about how to be really good at standing out from the competition. So if you too, client of mine, have a problem standing out from your competition, wouldn't you be interested in talking to someone who spends countless hours every year talking to other people about how to stand out from the competition?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's really what I like. When I started the podcast, my goal as a unknown in the consulting space, I mean, I'd worked in companies, but like out on my own, nobody knew who I was because I didn't network while also being in the corporate life, right? Like when I got on LinkedIn in the very early days, between the early days and when I decided to go into consulting, I had gone from 500 contacts on LinkedIn to 600 contacts in like 8 years. I never used it. I had no network. Right now I have a lot more, which we can talk about that. But like, I was nobody. So I created the podcast to put the content out there, and then to face that challenge like you're talking about. My goal was, by the time somebody got to me in a conversation, on a phone call or on Zoom, there was no longer a question in their mind, because they would have looked it up first, where what does this guy know about sales and why should I hire him? Instead, I wanted it always to be, here's my problem and how much is this going to cost to fix it? And how quickly can you, help me with X, Y, and Z? And that was kind of my goal. And then it got kicked into gear, which is helpful, I think, for this topic. I had a guest on my podcast early in the days. His name is Rob Howze, Howze. And I remember this conversation. Got to the end of the episode. I'm the host, right? And so I'm like, okay, Rob, where can people find you? The classic call to action, share with people so they can follow up with you. And he's like, Google it. I'm the #1 Rob Howze on Google, Howze. Just Google me and you'll find me. And I was like, that was the most amazing answer I'd ever heard for a call to action on any podcast as a listener ever. And then I was like, okay, we ended up, I stopped recording. I'm like, let me check myself. And I was like 3rd or 4th Jason Cutter on Google. And I was like, yeah, we need to fix that. And I think right now I mostly dominate the first 4 pages of Google for Jason Cutter. Just because I'm just like, I'm going to put out and be on every podcast I can so that it's clear, right? There's no mistaking me and the other Jason Cutters out there in the world.
I am winning you, Google. Don't you even think about it. So
don't even mess with me. If you search on your phone, I think I'm the first 4 pages, something like that. But it's not even like that was my goal to drive traffic and business. It's between finding out about me and chatting with me, somebody Googles me and goes, okay, I mean, last year alone, 2020, I was on 75 podcasts as a guest.
Wow.
And so it's like, okay, like obviously I'm out there. And so, how can I help you?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is, thank you for so graciously teeing yourself up for the next question. So is this, maybe not to the degree that you're doing it, but is what we're talking about today table stakes for salespeople? Is this a requirement?
I think so. I mean, I think the biggest thing that everyone needs to now be aware of and assume always happens, no matter what you're selling, especially if you're in a B2B where it's like it's somebody set an appointment with you or you're doing outreach on your behalf and a company's behalf versus in a call center on a dialer and they don't know who you are until they start talking to you. But you have to assume people are going to research and look it up. In fact, I will say, like for myself, when I get a phone call and I don't answer phone calls, we can have that conversation as well. Even as a call center guy, I don't answer it. The first thing I do is I go on Google and I research the number to see who it was, right? Maybe even before they've left me a voicemail, because I'm just curious who the heck is calling me. And so as a salesperson, as a sales professional, you have to assume people are doing research on your company, on your product or service, and on you, because all those are going to come up in the search and they're going to go, okay, let's check out John, John's LinkedIn page. Oh, here's John on Facebook. Let's check out John's Facebook page. Let's see all these things, right? Like all these things, like early internet recruiting things that got people in trouble. Like I remember interviewing someone and not hiring them when we found their Facebook page and they had I won't go into detail, but they had it was a costume party and they were trying to be, some gangster movie costume party. And I was like, this is not what we want in the company or our clients to find. So no. And I think that's the key. I think you have to have a good professional presence, which, it doesn't take a ton of time, but it takes some effort for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what we try to preach in our consulting work when we're trying to help set up sales plans is sometimes we have to take our sales leaders or within the organization on somewhat of a journey to recognize the entirety of what should be considered sales activity these days. And sometimes that is a painful and difficult discussion to have with people who have historically relied on a very metric-driven sales performance approach based on churn. Right. I mean, this is where I grew up. These are the approaches we used to use. It was why I had 13 people sit in the desk next to me in a 12-month period one year. Right. I'm aware of the grinder that is.
Yeah.
And where you and I and many like us would want to argue and not back down from, a podcast with 200 listens is an enormously valuable piece of content that happens every 2 weeks. Because if you're getting 200 people in a room and they're all listening to just you, or you and one other person, how valuable of is that in real sales time?
Yeah.
I mean, that's enormous. So to not allow your people the opportunity to use the shared resources of a marketing budget, I hope, to allow the people within your organization responsible for carrying your brand message to the street a chance to do some of that from creative content perspective. If somebody in the organization isn't doing it, you're going to lose to somebody who is.
Yeah. And I think too, like when I think of that, because I completely agree with you that it needs to be done, especially in this market and where the value is. It's semi intangible, because unless you have the perfect message with the perfect podcast, sticking on podcasts to the perfect audience where the right person is listening and literally has that issue and they're going to bite on your call to action, it's generally not so attributable to I got this lead because they heard me on this podcast. Mm-hmm. Right. And I've talked to a lot of people who guest on a lot of shows, and they're like, yeah, sometimes I get things, sometimes I don't. It's totally random. Someone could listen to a podcast in a year and a half from now and then be like, okay, now they reach out. So it's partially for that. But I think doing it for like attributable reasons is a dangerous game, because you're going to fall short when marketing's like, hey, what are the results getting for us? Or in sales is getting that. I think more of it is, what does that do for you on a search feature? Like I said, right? Like I would happily get on 10 podcasts a year with 200 downloads a year if it goes into my SEO or in my Google or on my LinkedIn and people are searching before calling me or returning my call. And it just validates me, right? They don't know how many listens it has. And then how much can you repurpose it? That's also the other part. How much can you take and make clips, send that to your newsletter, and just provide value beyond just the straight up listens? I mean, I'm happy to go on shows where it's their first episode. I love being a guest on a podcast it's their first episode, because everyone remembers their first guest. And it's just fun. And when I look through podcasts, I always go back to the first episode. I'm like, where did they start? Where are they at now? And I just think that's fun. And again, I'm not doing it for 1,000 leads a month coming in through call to action. I'm doing it for branding awareness. You hear me on enough podcasts, and at some point, right, it's like billboards. One billboard might not be the one that makes you call somebody, but you see it, billboards, TV ads, radio, digital things following you everywhere.
Well, and I think to your point, so I put a challenge to myself to give the presentation that went along with the book that I co-authored last year. And I said, we released the book in September of 2020. And I said, I'm going to give a presentation that goes with the book 20 times before the end of the year. And my co-author looked at me and he's like, you're bananas. Like, how do you think you're going to pull this off? And sure enough, I ended up giving it 32 times.
That's awesome.
In those days. And obviously we've gone on many more times to give it. And Stan and I have actually given it together. So we've done it a lot. But you know what it really does, Jason? And this is the other unsung part of what the content creation does for you as a salesperson is my pitch is pretty damn tight because I'm giving it a lot. Right. And so when I'm in front of someone, I don't have to worry about what I'm saying so much anymore. I'm just looking to see what's resonating because I know what I'm going to say because I've been giving this often. And I'm more interested in how can I make what I'm about to tell you make sense to you personally so that you'll get it in a way that will matter. And call that persuasion, call that authenticity, whatever you want to call it. It's reaching that person in the way that they need to be found in order for that trust to grow is the real skill. And if you're not sharp as a sword on what you're supposed to be saying, you miss out on so much of what else goes on, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, always, and anybody who's struggling in sales, one of the biggest things I notice is that they're too busy thinking about what they're going to say next or planning their next strategy and not actually listening, right? They're not present in the moment and figuring out what that person's saying, why they're saying it, and how to respond appropriately. They're too busy thinking. So I agree with you. The more you can do content, interviews, speaking, and I think one of the biggest things for especially individual contributors, but for companies on both, like for both realms in this, right, of salespeople and marketing, is put it under the category of marketing. Like that's what I do. A lot of people say, how do you have time to do so many podcasts? How do you have time to do so much, like not just the content creation, but like the podcast itself, guesting or hosting? I'm like, that's marketing. That's my marketing budget, right? Mentally, time-wise, whatnot, because that's the content I'm doing, right? Not
Yep.
cold calling people to convince them they have a problem, but doing it under this. And then again, how do you maximize it, right? How do you, as Gary Vee would say, how do you take something and just repurpose it, use it, slice it up, put it everywhere? I mean, he tells people, you should be making 64 pieces of content a day across all social media platforms. But how do you do that? How do you take one podcast conversation, slice it up, make a bunch of different things, and it takes a long time to build the machine to do that, but you just take it bit by bit, use every bit that you can. I've definitely failed a lot. I have a lot of content that has never seen the light of day. That drives me crazy because
Well,
of my inability or a laziness or lack of skill, for sure.
I liken it to almost like you're in the lab and there's Bunsen burners and like this thing's kind of boiling a little bit over here. And, we're the scientists and we're trying to manage all of these experiments because that's what really drives our curiosity is let's try some things and see what happens. And
Yeah.
when they work, you do them for 4+ years. Like have arrived at this stage of having done a show that, what most people tell you is after 18 months of anything, you should rethink it. And while the way we do the show has evolved over the years, what it's about is the same as it was the day I started. It was, what am I curious about when it comes to being the very best at being in sales? That's not just skill development. Are you going bananas? Are you depressed? Are you drinking too much? Are you not in alignment with your values with what you do? Because that's a problem for a lot of people. And so it's been really fascinating to watch during the pandemic. What's happened to my listenership is been pretty substantial from the way their careers have all been impacted. And so it's been really interesting to watch as careers are being reimagined. So I was going to say, so now you've been on a bajillion shows during this stretch of the last 18 months. How has being on the shows, how is it different? And what about COVID is really like feeding into how that may or may not be changing?
It's my answer is going to be a little bit different than maybe expected. I didn't try to be on podcasts pre-pandemic, right? So if we look at 2019, that wasn't really a thought. I don't even remember the first podcast I was on, but it wasn't a strategy. It wasn't an idea. Let me get on podcasts.
Got it.
It wasn't until I was in the evolution and editing process of my book, which came out in August of last year, right? Yours came out in September, mine came out in August. So it's similar timelines in our process together. But it was in that where I'm like, okay, one good strategy is get on podcasts. Let me talk about it. Let me just talk about business and let me just talk about sales. And so it really started mostly last year, which is obviously then the pandemic happened, and made it so that people were at home, which for me was fine because I was already doing some stuff virtual. What it did was it really made me step up my game with my video setup, my audio setup, my background.
Right.
That was a catalyst. It sucked beforehand, and I was working on it before the pandemic hit, and then I just kept evolving it. But really, I think it's about people just wanting content. And then if you have something that's also topical and relevant, right? Like my book is called Selling with Authentic Persuasion. When the pandemic hit, the biggest thing, if you look through LinkedIn, advice to salespeople and sellers was, now's the time for empathy, right? Like it's all about empathy, and use empathy, and and just build relationships. And I was looking through that feed and going, wait, that's what it always should have been. Like what the hell have you been doing to people? Like you're why sales has a bad connotation in the world, because you're now realizing that maybe you should care about people and use empathy and build relationships. Like what the so but having a topic that resonates no matter what is helpful. And then the part that was really helpful for me was not traveling to clients' offices, not traveling to conferences. So literally I could do 2, 3, 4 guest appearances a day, right? Like depending on the schedule, you're just here. I'm here all the time.
Right. You'll laugh. So just to do a quick little backup, we'll do Tarantino. Let's go back here for a second so of those presentations that I gave in 2020, 8 of them were for one person who booked a number of events throughout the course of a month at different locations.
Okay.
So that was awesome. Picked up 8 right away. What I didn't realize was every one of those presentations was largely to the same group of people. With only slight variations in the total attendance. So Jason, no joke, I gave 8 succinctly different versions of that presentation. And by like the 3rd or 4th time, the people who were in attendance were coming up to me afterwards going like, this is impressive, right? Like everybody else, when they come, it's the same 8 conversations 8 times and we stop listening. And you keep throwing new curveballs at us about the same story every single time. Like, are you going to be able to go 8 for 8? And I was like, baby, I could go 30 for 30. Let's go. Like
all day, man.
All day, because I've developed the content library to be able to draw upon in those moments when presented that kind of opportunity to show. I mean, to me, that's really what we're saying is the end result of personal brand building within the context of your B2B sales is authority. And if you've done it and you've done it well, the content speaks for itself. And whether it's always edited perfectly or sounds awesome every single time, probably not, but largely the audience stays. And that is incredibly valuable as a salesperson, to know that you have a community of people who are listening to what it is you have to say. And then secondarily for me, and I know you do this too, I use my interviews as ways to move people down funnel.
Yeah.
Like, hey, Jason, this reminds me of a conversation I happened to have with Anthony Anarino. And it's really like, there's a really piece of this I really want you to listen to. Would you be cool after we're done if I sent you a link to that and like, can I follow up with you later to see what your thoughts were on that? Like, think about that as opposed to like, what's the most next appropriate step for me to move you to the next stage of the sales process? Like, right? Which would you prefer as the prospect? I mean, that's the way I look at it is, how would I want that engagement to go if it were me on the other side? And to know that like, hey, this guy's the real deal because I prove it in person, but then I have all of the game to back it up behind me when the person is going to do invariably what you said, which is go try to poke around and find out whether or not what they got from you was real or if it was manufactured. Yeah. Right. And so to me, that's, I hold a very small flashlight to your beacon when it comes to just the sheer quantity of it. But and if the audience doesn't get it by now, I don't know what else we can possibly tell them. But the only other thing I wanted, like, given what so sheer quantity of conversations you're having with people out there today, where, for my guests, as salespeople, as opportunists, as people who look for ways to take advantage of when things are changing, what are you hearing that seems like, wow, everyone's attention seems to be on X?
And I think one of the biggest things is I'll say is people's attention is not on webinars, right? So let me go at this with what's coming to mind. The standard is let's just do webinars, and people don't want to do webinars. People don't want to attend it. There's webinar fatigue. I know early pandemic, I remember one day in particular, I was hosting one webinar and had signed up for 4 other webinars to attend in one day. And I was like, wait, I got to get work done. And I had 0 attendees for mine, like registered, because it was just like overwhelming. I was like, I need to do webinars. And I realized, wait, people have to work and they're busy or they're at home. So I think other strategies, I'll tell you one thing that I have been doing that a friend of mine told me last year that he did, and then I've done several of them last year or this year, is actually paid workshops. So it's interesting thing, depending on what you have for your network, is instead of a free webinar with a bunch of slides for 30 minutes, is a 2-hour paid workshop mastermind session, no slides, talking about a solution, bringing in an expert. So a lot of times I'm the expert. So I'll work with vendor partners, like let's say somebody who sells a CRM platform. And then literally it's like, okay, how do you help your, it's for VPs of sales in winning in the hybrid call center environment, right? And then it's 2 hours of ideas and going back and forth, no slides. Slides are gross. And so, that kind of thing. And it's fun because it's not about the money. It's about skin in the game. So people want to show up and then they have a high expectation of value. Then you deliver it. And if you're partnered with someone who, is good alignment with what you do, it could be amazing for building your network, making new connections, getting your foot in the door some places. So that one's really fun. You don't ever hear about that. I share that with some of my partners and they're like, yeah, let's do that. $49.99 price range, just enough. This is enough to get somebody to like actually show up. And I have 100% attendance for those people actually show up. Which compared to a webinar, right, where you have 100 people register, 3 show up, and it's probably, one of them might be your mom, and then like, who else is there? Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
And nobody comes on screen, like you're just talking to blackness, like please. Someone.
You're just like a one-way, just like vomiting some stuff and hoping. Anyway. It doesn't. That's the people don't want that anymore. People want more engagement, more personalized content. I think that's important. I think one of the best things you can do is, podcasts are good. Obviously, we're talking about podcasts on a podcast show about, sales. I think the more you can do live stuff, the more you can just be a thought expert. And no matter what, like I'm thinking of all levels of salespeople, all level of experience, like what can you do to produce some content, especially when you look at like LinkedIn is so noisy depending on who you're getting to. LinkedIn loves LinkedIn Live. So if you have access to that, you turn that on, it alerts the world because they want people to be tuned in. So those kind of things that go beyond just I'm going to post every day or 3 times a day. Like, I think that's important. I think you also fundamentally, it's always the same. Where are your people spending the most time? Again, going back to my story about when I started consulting, I had 600 contacts. Over 8 years, I grew from 500 to 600 contacts, right? I was running call centers. I did not have time or the desire to be on LinkedIn every day or ever. It was like once a year I would log in and be like, this is gross, and then log out, right? That was it because I was busy in the job. So I think what you really have to do is understand, who are you talking to? Where do they hang out? Because as a consultant, here's what's interesting is I'm like, I would get referrals and I would, have clients hire me and then, or companies hire me. And then I'm like, okay, but I look at their LinkedIn and they have 3 contacts or connections. I'm like, they're not on LinkedIn. And then while I'm hanging out with them, I see them scrolling through Facebook while they're in between calls or while they're trying to decompress. I'm like, oh, they're all on Facebook or Instagram, right? You mean you can't be creepy business-wise, but like, where can you get their attention? Where are they hanging out? And how can you find them? And then start the conversation. And here's the key. You said it about authenticity and like, what people are looking for, and they want to know if they can trust you, is putting stuff out there that doesn't feel salesy. Don't be that person who's like, hi, I'm Jason. Here's what I sell. Would you be interested in this? Like, we get those. It's so gross. Keep in mind, like,
every LinkedIn in-mail known to man is connect to pitch. I'm like, why does anyone think connect to pitch is a good strategy? I don't get it.
And it's a numbers game and it must work, or those people start it and then they bought some course and they thought that this worked and then they eventually, fail and go away. But there's enough new
Yeah.
suckers born every minute, like they say, right, that are going to try this strategy. It's just so gross. So keep that in mind. I mean, my number one advice to salespeople in general, if they push me for one thing, is just do the opposite of what everyone else is doing. Do the opposite of what you think salespeople, air quotes, are supposed to do, and you'll probably win.
Yeah.
Where you do it is, in my opinion, not as important. If you know where your people hang out that you want to talk to, and you don't do the normal thing, and just act like a human that you would want to interact with yourself, and I promise that will work if you play the long game.
You will be most of the way down the field against the competition. That much is for sure. And it's my good friend Kirby, again, Mr. Prolific content creator that he is. He says all the time, the biggest gap is the distance between I know and I do. And knowing that, it's one thing to say, this is what I really should be doing. It's something completely different to scheduling it into blocks of time in your day and week and month and year to make sure that the sausage, as we called it, is getting made. So
Yeah.
Jason, where can people find you next? Where like if someone wants to start checking you out, where do you want them to go? Not to be
I feel like I
salesy.
already answered that in the beginning when we talked about this factory. Best thing, and what I've done to make it simple, because I have so many things going on and I end up with all these call to actions and I felt like I was all over the place. So jasoncutter.com, I turned that domain into my hub, like a link tree of everything I have going on: books, podcasts, coaching program for salespeople, program for sales executives. Like, it's all there. Again, like I said earlier, when in doubt, if you Google Jason Cutter, you will find more than enough stuff on me to where to get started. And then if anyone has questions, they want ideas, they want thoughts, email me, jason@cutterconsultinggroup.com. The biggest thing for this conversation, I would say, is just take it one step at a time. Set a nice goal. Like, I'm going to post 3 times a week. I'm at 0. Don't try to go from 0 to twice a day. You will fail. It's like trying to go to the gym. Be like, I'm going to go to the gym 7 days a week, twice a day, and I'm eat perfect and never eat another carb. You will fail by like the 3rd day. So just start small and build up, which, again, you look at what I have and what you have out there, it looks like this is crazy. But if you look at me years ago or even months ago, like, it's not the same.
What you was say, a hard takes a day, impossible takes a week. I mean,
Yeah.
But I remember the first time I tried to do an edit of one of my pieces of audio, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And now I can do that in my sleep. It's just, it's the repetition of doing the exercise without fail that really gives you the value that you're looking for.
And one more thing, because I know we want to wrap up, but one other tip that really helped me last year was find a group and join some kind of challenge, whether it's a paid challenge or it's a free challenge, and join a group that has a goal. For example, last year, I joined a 30 days of LinkedIn video challenge where there was a group of us supporting each other. The people had done it a few times. So they gave tips on batching and editing and how to do that and topic selection, but literally like post every single day for 30 days on LinkedIn, not live, just posting a recording. And that was so helpful. Like having a group, learning, even if you don't succeed in all 30 days or whatever that challenge is, that will help you kind of break some momentum too.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's awesome. All right. So thank you again. And so concludes what is the audio portion of the show. Now, I also post the video version on Social Good Promotions LinkedIn page, and we do one bonus question. And the bonus question is Jason Cutter gets to ask Roger Burnett something about sales that you are interested in, my perspective on, as a fellow purveyor of all things selling.
Well, I am glad, because I wasn't sure exactly why I needed to put pants on today, but this just proves like this is why. Not that you can see it, just it has a different, it carries different on video. So this is perfect. So I think the biggest thing is this is one of the questions I think about a lot is, what have you seen in buyers, right? If you're talking B2B, they're still humans, but they're approaching it different. how have buyers changed in your experience in sales? What are they looking for now? And where do you see that changing in the near future? Like relative to like how they want to buy or who they
Yeah.
want to deal with?
Yeah. It's gross. It's a mess. Like in the consideration process that most people go through, they don't want anybody messing with them while they're doing that consideration. And
Mm,
that used to be the role of a salesperson, was to assist in the consideration process by highlighting the features that were most advantageous to our solution and put us in an advantage against our competition because we knew their strengths and weaknesses as well. It was our job to communicate that well and make the client be able to understand it in their own terms because there was no internet. There was no way for that person to validate what was being said. So the internet changed all of that and made it so that now we're not really needed, right, wrong, or indifferent. And the only real instance where we become valuable again is when the preponderance of choice on the part of the buyer is so great that they can't figure out what to do. So Google buying a coffee mug and see how many ways you can do that, right? None of them involve me. But if you want to know how to get a coffee mug that is made from sustainable products or maybe using a closed loop recycling process, like that's where I'm coming in because that's where we bring the value to the transaction. But the person going through the consideration process may go all the way to the end and never even know that I was there to add value to the decision that they make. And so their mistakes turn them against our entire what we do, which
hmm,
is a major, major problem because for those people doing business with creatives like us using this medium to their advantage, they're kicking those other people's ass,
yeah.
right? And we're keeping products out of that closet that everybody has with the branded merch that didn't go so well. That everybody's worried about, like, ooh, what should I do with this stuff? Or the World Series t-shirts that end up in Costa Rica because it wasn't the right team, right? I
Yep.
mean, that's bad for the planet. And we don't like that. So we espouse this whole no shitty promo strategy of like, no, we're not going to let you do that. So for me, what really is changed about selling now is someone has to want that and needs to find me. And they go looking for that, I'm going to be found relatively easily because there's so much content that I've done that ties me to this topic that if someone starts looking up sustainability merchandise in branding or closed loop recycling, like I'm going to show up in that process because I've put all the time in. So I get reintroduced into the consideration phase when the client who makes the mistake and the stuff goes in the closet eventually goes, hey, I don't want to keep doing this. I should try to find someone to do it better. Or
Yep.
they come across me some way through speaking or, a presentation that I'm giving that gives them the opportunity to go, oh, well, shit, why wasn't I just using this person before? Because what I find often, Jason, is so there's two things that really, so consideration phase, getting shut out of as a salesperson is a major problem. And having authenticity and credibility helps fix that problem. But two, people are so worried about making a mistake in their decision making that in many instances, we're not fighting me against somebody else. It's fighting me against no decision
Right.
because the person on the other end of the transaction feels like the stakes are too high to make a decision that would involve this, whatever it is that they've been considering. Right. And so, and especially in an environment where there are multiple decision makers, the waiting, I wrote a blog post called "The Waiting is the Hardest Part." It's terrible, the amount of time that the consideration phase is taking now because all of the stakeholders are not together with any kind of regularity for them to move the process forward. And you have varying degrees of appetite for risk
Right.
at this stage of what's going on. So here we sit. And for me, what Zoom did is the intimate, quiet conversation I used to be able to have with you as a prospect in person, off the record, where you would kind of, hey, let me kind of clue you into what's going on right now and why we haven't necessarily gotten anywhere, but here's what we need to do. And that would happen. Now, not quite so much, I don't think. So to me, those two things working in tandem have made the role of a salesperson much more difficult. And I, like you, agree wholeheartedly that the single best strategy to use to try to overcome this problem is to adopt a content-led strategy, just like you have. So, you're preaching to the choir, brother.
But I love it. I obviously I couldn't agree more for so many reasons. We could make that a whole nother episode and conversation. But yeah, I think that's what you said and what I have experienced in different verticals as well is exactly what salespeople should be looking at and thinking about and what they're doing, which is what are people doing for consideration? Comfort zone is real and everyone is human, no matter what size organization they're at. So not making a decision is always the safest and best way to go than even buying. And a lot of salespeople think their job is to just push people into something. So I love it.
All right, man. I dig it. I love talking to you. Home and home anytime you want. You just give your boy a holler and I'll bring the goods and life will be grand. I appreciate you, Jason.
Sounds good. Thanks, Roger.
Take care, man.